Hi, welcome to another edition of Socialist Telly, Your NHS. Today I'm joined again by the fantastic Dr. Yusuf El-Gingahi and my comrade Nico there. We're talking about the second half of Yusuf's superb book, How to Dismantle the NHS in 10 Easy Steps. Do you want to hold a copy up, Yusuf? Because it doesn't show very clearly for me.
Looks like a hologram on yours.
Yeah. Thank you. So, as I said in the first show, absolutely required reading. If you get a chance to read it, please grab a copy because it sets out really clearly the threat that our NHS has been under for the last 40 years, really, although the pace of the privatisation of the NHS has never been moving more rapidly than it is right now. So, Yusuf, would you like to start us off? I've just thought it would be really nice to start covering the main points that we discussed in the last show. Yeah. So if you'd like to talk us through the first sort of 5 steps, that would be really, really helpful.
Do a rapid review.
Just a quick review, and then hopefully anyone watching this will have a chance to go back through our Socialist Telly stream and watch part 1 when they've seen this, so they've got the full picture.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite helpful of us, obviously, to do this work for the mainstream media, for probably Parliament, and for all the other constituencies who are meant to be representing people. But yeah, perhaps if they paid some attention, then the NHS debate might not be so kind of convoluted and misleading, because frankly, if you do pick up, one of the things that I think made me write this book was that it took me, despite being steeped in politics from a young age, because of my late father and mainly, it took me a long time to work out what was happening to the NHS, and that's speaking as a medical student and then a junior doctor. It took me until probably until the coalition government, the Conservative-led coalition, frankly. There were kind of vague hints that I picked up on before, shortly before that, but it wasn't really until the Health and Social Care Act 2012, which in its bill form was going through Parliament in 2011, that I really woke up. The scales dropped from my eyes with regards to the NHS specifically. So the thing that was, as Orwell says, right in front of your nose, as a junior doctor, as a medical student for the best part of 12, 13 years before that, I was oblivious to. And when you pick up a newspaper, when you watch a debate on BBC or wherever it might happen to be, whichever TV channel, it's just completely stripped of any context, any background, any actual real understanding of what has been happening to the NHS over the past 40 years. And that's one of the things that really drove me to write this book, to set out, to flesh out a narrative of those, as you say, those 40 years, the past 4 decades of market-based reforms. But yeah, anyway, apart from that introduction, yeah, I mean, I've obviously tried to outline, tongue-in-cheek slightly, 10 steps for dismantling the NHS. Of course, that's not my intention. I don't belong to the Centre for Policy Studies or any of the other extreme free market think tanks. So this journey began I guess in the 80s, so under Thatcher, with the introduction of the first beginnings really of outsourcing. So things like catering, cleaning, laundry services, all of that stuff was outsourced to private companies. What was known, I guess at the time, I'm not sure if it's still the case, as the Big 7 companies at that time. The first kind of big step in the book, if you like, is actually the 1990 legislation onwards, which was to create a market inside the NHS, the beginnings of it. And that was the internal market. It's referred to as an internal market. But again, it's part of this marketing spiel, management doublespeak that doesn't really mean very much. It just means a limited market in which you've divided the NHS up into trusts, into GP or community trusts, and then hospital trusts. And the idea was to create competition, for example, between the providers, the hospital services, along market principles, with the idea that if more patients or customers, consumers, whatever misguided term you might want to use in these market analogies, would presumably use the better hospitals. That was one of the ideas, as well as improving services, reducing costs. But in fact, within about 10, maybe slightly more, 12, 13 years, the Department of Health commissioned its own review, a study from York University, which showed the opposite. It showed that costs had skyrocketed. Administrative costs in that limited market had gone up by nearly 10%. So the admin budget for the NHS was pretty lean back in the days when it was a Bevanite model. So along the lines of its of one, well, its founder, if you like, who was the Labour Health Secretary after the war in the Clement Attlee government, and that was an Iron Bevan, and that was a truly public system of universal healthcare. And then, so you go up to, this would have been the 70s, up till the 70s, the admin budget was 5%. And that by 2003, it shot up with the introduction of market reforms to 14%. It's now much higher than that. So that was really the first step. The second step was under actually New Labour. And so in came New Labour under Tony Blair, promising to reverse the internal market, the limited market, but actually from 2000 onwards, under the stewardship of, well, obviously Tony Blair, but health secretaries such as Alan Milburn and Simon Stevens, of course, who has sadly departed recently, to universal tributes and acknowledgements of how wonderful he is. We'll come back to him. But he was one of the key New Labour people who basically expanded that market through, well, what were called independent sector treatment centres, so private, basically companies outsourcing of operation waiting lists, other outsourcing really for clinical services on a scale that hitherto hadn't been conceived of at that stage, and PFI, most importantly perhaps, which was a public-private partnership to build infrastructure such as hospitals, schools, roads, railways, prisons, of which NHS hospitals was the biggest part. And that's left NHS trusts and, of course, all of us with huge debts. So the NHS is left with debts now of approximately, we don't know the exact figures because all of this is behind closed doors. It's all treated as if it's national security, but it's behind a kind of corporate firewall. So we don't know the exact terms, conditions, even perhaps details of some of these payments for these hideously expensive mortgages. But basically, we understand that we're left with something in the region of about £80 billion of debt. Obviously, some of that has been paid off because we're well into the terms of these bankrupting mortgages. But those hospitals would have, if they'd been funded directly in a kind of old-fashioned way from the government, from the Treasury, would have cost more like about £11 billion. So that's a differential of about sevenfold, which goes off as a revenue stream to these corporate consortia. So consortia of construction firms, financial companies, banks, the actual facilities management companies that provide the services. If you go into any NHS hospital today, you will probably see, if you're careful, this is all quite well concealed. If you look at the logos that staff are wearing, you will see something like Serco or G4S or ISS or Interserve or whatever it might be, which are these some of these outsourcing, well, some of these corporate, some of these companies that are part of these massive kind of PFI contracts, and the hospitals are basically locked into these contracts in a sense. So if they want to change a door frame or a light bulb or whatever it might be, rehang a door, they have to go through these contractors, and the costs are much greater than they would be. And I give a few examples from, and a lot of this has actually been attacked incidentally by the right-wing press, so this isn't really a right or left issue specifically. It seems that the Daily Telegraph, Daily Mail were actually some of the most vociferous at the time voices attacking this because they saw it as a Labour kind of creature, a Labour creation. But one example was the cost of rehanging a door, which ended up being, I can't remember what it should have cost, but it was something like £750 in the end. Was the original cost. It ended up costing, I think, 50,000. So that was just one example of these kind of rip-off merchants. But PFI, yeah, I mean, on a national scale, all the infrastructure, not just NHS, we've been left with debts over several decades of over £300 billion. So that's an obscene amount. To put that into perspective, for example, the government's estimates for the cost, the annual cost of health tourism, which obviously the tabloids bang on about, that the NHS is being destroyed because it's become an international health service and all this nonsense. That's about 300 million. So go figure, who's to blame for the crises that we're facing. Is it 300 billion, which is to do with the corporate and financial elite, or 300 million, which is the estimate for, the victims of global capitalism, really? So, yeah, I think Nico wants to say something.
Yeah, thanks, Yusuf.
That money needs to come out from a fixed NHS budget, doesn't it? It's not something that the government will just pay off outside of that. And it has, it's written to the contracts that those payments are prioritised over anything, that patients might need, for example. It's not just, it's worth, there's more to it than just some money that's owed, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, those trusts have basically, some of them, have basically gone into huge financial problems. I know that from where I was working in Tower Hamlets, and we had the biggest PFI on our patch at Barts in the Royal London, very famous hospitals. And there were two big PFI projects built at the Royal London and St Bartholomew's, for the combined cost to be repaid by 2049 of about £7 billion. Should have cost £1 billion. So £6 billion that just gets siphoned off as revenue to these consortia. And as you say, that cost is paid obviously from the local health budget for East London, for Tower Hamlets, instead of going towards frontline services and patient care. And the result was that Barts Health basically started downbanding, downgrading staff, sacking hundreds of staff members, if not more, reducing salaries. Obviously, the impact on services was massive, and that's across the country. There's about 100 PFI hospitals, so that's the case up and down the country. But those PFI hospitals are kept going, often at the cost of neighbouring hospitals, which are then end up in a merger. So that's what happened in Barts Health, was that other hospitals that in the vicinity have been merged in. So Whipps Cross, Newham, for example, they're all now under this umbrella, and they're all suffering from these huge PFI costs, which go to Skanska, a big Scandinavian construction firm, Innisfree, which is a financial company in the City of London that employs something like 30 people, according to its website. So that's plastered on the walls of Barts Health. Skanska, Innisfree is the main PFI stakeholder there.
I mean, it's worth noting as well that these PFI deals, they're not like a mortgage that a person might take out on a property, insofar as the trust will never actually own the hospital or the buildings that are being built. It's an extortionate amount of rent, effectively, for a piece of property that will never belong to the trust, will not be an asset that the trust can then liberate should there be a change of direction or a change of plan. So it's like paying your rent to cover the landlord's mortgage on a credit card that you're paying compound interest on forevermore. When in actual fact, what ought to have happened, and what many of us were arguing at the time and still arguing now, is that funding ought to be made available by the government in order to invest in our NHS. Then it would have belonged to us. Then we would have been paying the cost rather than paying to line shareholders and offshore fund holders' pockets without NHS budgets. And of course, that money, as you both pointed out earlier, to pay that is coming out of individual NHS trust budgets. Now, I think personally we need to take a look at the NHS in this country, because already it's been divided into NHS England, NHS Wales, NHS Scotland, which is breaking it up and fragmenting the care across the UK. But then it gets broken down even further. So you end up having individual trusts almost competing with each other for resources and skills. So that sets a problem. Another thing as well, I think that in the 90s we first became aware of was the problems with outsourcing are huge. So first of all, if a company wants to bid for a contract, a lot of them will place a bid that's significantly lower than they actually need to pay it, and they'll write that money off so they've got the contract and they'll redeem it, recoup it later. And what we saw was cleaning companies hiring people on very low salaries, investing very little in equipment and so on. In the 90s, we had the terrible disaster of the MRSI infections, hospital-acquired infections that were not treatable through antibiotics and so on. And that had a massive impact on people's health. And another thing we need to look at is some of the contracts that were given out for the NHS went to a company called Carillion. Now, Carillion got contracts to refurbish hospitals, amongst other things. And because of the way that they managed their finances, they actually went bankrupt, which meant that the trust had paid a company for a certain amount of work to be done. They're neither going to get their money back nor have the work done. So this is a massive money merry-go-round for a lot of these companies getting stakes in our hospitals, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, this is all part of really financialization of the economy, of housing, of public services, that you turn things that should be really social good, whether that's healthcare, education, housing, public services, you turn that into a financial instrument. That's what's happened with the housing market in the UK, especially in London and other metropolitan centres. Is it's been those housing mortgages have been turned into financial instruments for international investors. PFI and other public-private partnerships are obviously a very good example of that. So who are the winners? Are global investors, are financial institutions, banks, hedge funds, private equity, etc. These are the really big winners. I mean, you highlight obviously the likes of Carillion, other outsourcing fiascos that we have seen, and there's a whole gravy train, as you point out, of magic circle law firms, big three management consultancies, big four accounting firms who are meant to do the kind of the reports for these accounts for companies like Enron or whoever, Carillion, who've then gone bankrupt. So yes, it's basically corruption, it's a merry-go-round, it's a gravy train, and the only silver lining really with COVID is that some of this has come front and center and has been highlighted in a way it wasn't pre-COVID. I think many more people are aware of the fiasco of test and trace, with a £37 billion budget over 2 years, and how that's been outsourced to the likes of Deloitte, who are an accountancy firm, Serco, Sodexo, MITI, who are all outsourcing companies who've long been involved in the NHS and public services. So I think that's been highlighted. I think much more people are much more aware and outraged of that, which can only be, I would assume, a good thing. But I mean, outsourcing, you see, is very complicated. In other words, I mean, you've referred there to the loss leader, which is something that apparently the likes of Serco deploy. That if you're trying to win, for example, these NHS contracts, you're obviously putting in a secret bid, and what you deliberately do is you underbid, knowing full well that you're not going to cover the service you're delivering with that budget. But the point is, you win those contracts, you win enough of those contracts that you basically form a monopoly. You've got a monopoly, and later on, you can then obviously maybe renegotiate, hike up the costs, whatever it might be, and that's the loss leader strategy. I mean, you could argue it's similar to what Starbucks and other companies do with what they call cannibalization, where you open multiple chains in a very small area, such as a high street, knowing that, say, 2 out of your 3 chains are not going to make a profit, but the idea is to destroy the local competition, and then you can shut 2 of your chains down and keep 1 or 2 others. So yeah, loss leader, cannibalization, these are all strategies. And the problem with outsourcing, one of the many problems, is that when you look at clinical services, NHS hospitals make their revenue from within this market system from those kind of high what are known as kind of low risk, high throughput services, such as physiotherapy or elective procedures such as cataracts, joint replacements, and that basically effectively pays for the more complex healthcare, such as, say, strokes or emergency medicine, intensive care, whatever it might be. And so if you start to basically what's called unbundling, if you start to unbundle those services so they're no longer in-house, then you're basically siphoning away that money that would have previously paid for the other services. So when, for example, David Cameron specifically he used to stand at the dispatch box, and I'm sure his successors have probably said similar things, but he used to stand there and say, it doesn't matter who provides the service as long as it's free. And so this was an incredibly misleading statement. Whether he understood this fully or not, I mean, to be perfectly honest, I'm not entirely sure, because he would have, it's not actually David Cameron or Jeremy Hunt really, or Matt Hancock or Sajid Javid, who actually really come up with all the details of this policy. It's all drawn up by the big kind of corporate interests who stand to benefit from this, who are, but we know the influence of the likes of McKinsey, for example, on NHS policy has been profound. But anyway, yeah, as usual, I tend to digress onto various terms.
Well, it's all so interrelated, isn't it? It's such an audacious theft in front of our eyes of our most valued institution in this country. I think someone described the NHS as almost the national religion in the UK. So it won't be taken from us in plain sight. It is being taken from us by stealth. So it's important that each of the key players and elements of this are thoroughly understood by everybody out there, because we've got to build up our fight to stop this happening any further. So I think that you've pretty much covered the first sort of 3 steps of your book so far. So that's the public, the internal market, public-private partnerships, and the corporate takeover. So then, from what you've just said about the big 4 and so on, the next section the next chapter of your book was about installing a revolving door. And my goodness, is it spinning right now? I'd like to explain a little bit more about that, just briefly.
Yeah, I think, absolutely. It's spinning, and we're all getting vertigo from from that. I mean, basically, this is part of the bigger picture. You have to kind of take a step back and say, how has this all happened? How is this kind of heist, this great NHS heist, as Bob Gill and his co-producers have labelled it in their documentary? This is a great NHS heist. It's larceny. It's our money, our healthcare system, which is basically being converted into a massive funding stream for these big corporations and financial institutions. How was that enabled? Well, it's been enabled through the revolving door, through lobbyists, through donations to political parties, through all of these basically strategies that you might label as corporate capture. And the revolving doors is probably one of the key ones, whereby we've seen health secretaries, health ministers, parliamentarians, the kind of senior levels of the Department of Health go off through that revolving door to work for private healthcare or other corporate interests who are benefiting from all of this. So we saw that with, the likes of New Labour health secretaries, with Tory health secretaries and ministers. We've seen that pattern, and that's basically, we saw most memorably with Simon Stevens, that his kind of biography became emblematic of what's happened to the NHS, that he started off as an NHS manager. He became an advisor to Alan Milburn. He was then an advisor to Tony Blair in Downing Street, became the main health advisor, then went off through the revolving door to work for United Health, who are the biggest private healthcare and insurance corporation in the world. Worked there for the best part of a decade, where we understand that he was pushing the EU-US trade agreement, TTIP, that would have potentially endangered the NHS and public services, would have, at the time, I mean, now we're talking obviously more about post-Brexit trade agreements, but would do the same thing, which is to open up our health services and our public services to global capital, to private, to American private healthcare and insurance firms. And so he was there for the best part of a decade. He was also, at the time, I don't know if he was again personally involved in this, but he, Health were very much opposed to Obamacare, which was, far from perfect, but it was certainly at least an attempt at reforming some of the most hideous aspects of the US healthcare system. So this was the track record of United Health, who, by the way, have a catalogue of fraud, which they've paid off, as has been documented, millions, in fact hundreds of millions of dollars in fines to various branches and divisions of local and national government in the US, and even shareholders. So that's their track record. So he was there for 10 years, and then he was hired by Cameron to come back and run the NHS, where he's been constantly the recent tributes paid to him across the board, where he pushed basically something called integrated care that we'll come to later, but is essentially US style healthcare that's being sold as something great, and that's going to mean that we're going to integrate health and social care, or health care, the NHS, with local government and all this. And I think Nico wants to chime in.
Yeah. Well, a few things. An interesting article from 2004 asks how come Stevens left to join United Health, and then it quotes friends of Stevens saying essentially that he found the way that United, that the ministers weren't very pleased with the way the buying and selling was going on in the English NHS, and Simon found what United Health was doing in Medicare and Medicaid provision in the US more promising, and the article suggests that's why he was going there. There was a suggestion this was a government level wish to pursue what was happening in England, rather than a personal career move. And it goes in the wake of talks between the US and the UK on healthcare, and a bilateral agreement that was signed in 2001 between Alan Milburn and his counterpart Tommy Thompson on healthcare quality, which is part of a process that began to involve those companies as well as different parts of the US state. And also very important, I mean, there was an article in Private Eye recently about Alan Milburn, and if I'm not mistaken, it was about the integrated care, accountable care organizations today, and it mentioned PFI, but it didn't mention that Milburn and Stevens and that team were developing that in the UK, and their mass hospital closure programs, and on PFI, Alison Pollock again said, for almost every new PFI hospital built, 3 hospitals close. Right, and that hasn't stayed in the public's memory really. The story has, especially with right-wingers running shadow health, tragically under a left-wing leadership, the message has come out is good funding, bad underfunding, whereas the same destructive policies were going on using funding as a means of buying people off. Blair says in his autobiography how, he said, I had to get the money in order to get the reforms. That they had a few things to play with, extra funding, extra staff, and in return, they were able to do things with the private sector they wouldn't have been able to do, and so on. And he's talking about the policy plan that was Stevens. If you go on LinkedIn, Stevens has got a page now, and he says himself that he was a key author of the NHS Plan 2000. He didn't used to appear there, but he does now. I would say he needs a job, but
TV, yeah.
He doesn't need a job, but he's on LinkedIn anyway. So and because this week we have an NHS campaigner, supposed NHS campaigner, who's come out saying how basically he was lobbied by Stevens at the start of his founding of the National Health Action Party, and he says it's like oblivious. He's saying, oh, the guy, he even paid for the coffee. They have a budget for that stuff. It's not very, you're a bit cheap actually if your coffees.
I'm sure it wasn't 3 cups of coffee that bought him.
It was. He gave him his private email address. He answered personal queries. Why do you think that is? It'd be interesting to ask a few people in the wider, broader left if they have been approached by someone maybe in an anorak called Simon Stevens, maybe not in an anorak, just something sleazy, because
brown paper envelopes again, isn't it?
Well, he has apparently got a way of. It sounds really strange if you look at him, but of charming people in person.
Mm.
And he lobbied Jeremy's Lotto. He lobbied Jeremy's Lotto through John Ashworth and John McDonnell for several years. The Health Service Journal published in late 2019, when it was too bloody late, that Stevens had been lobbying. They don't put it that way, but they've been having conversation with Ashworth and John McDonnell.
Who's this
for several years? Simon Stevens in person.
Lobbied who? Lobbied
Jeremy Corbyn's party.
Oh.
Yes. We had an opposition to Stevens' plans in 2016 when there were sustainability and transformation plans.
Mm-hmm.
That disappeared into thin air when pretty much it slowly waned away, actually, when John Ashworth took over. And his lines, in the context of national programs of service closures that are strategically done, so you're closing A&Es and replacing them, which are not profitable to run, and you're replacing them with a US thing called urgent care centers by any other name, which are profitable to run. You've got companies that take these things over because that's what they're for, and people are left without A&Es. So people missed stuff on Stevens. He has been restructuring the service in a way that creates profit opportunities, rather than saying we're contracting this out, we're contracting that out. We're contracting it all out. Look at us. That's Matt Hancock. That's David Cameron. That flamboyant, arrogant kind of corruption in your face. But the other stuff, flashing it all. But that's
Cameron was called Flash. His nickname, Flashman.
Flashman. Yeah.
Okay, right. I knew Dodgy Dave. But the other stuff came with a narrative. It said, it's a nonsense narrative. We have an aging population with complex needs, and there's a funding squeeze. Obviously, that's come from God or from the sky. It's not political. It's just a funding squeeze. It just happened. So we're going to have to live with it, and we're going to have to sort of deal with it. And therefore, we're going to do the things that we were doing when there was a huge funding for the NHS. We're going to do the same things, but we're going to have a different narrative about it. And a lot of people have just gone along with that because there was no narrative in the mainstream that said anything different. That said, as Diane Abbott said in 2016, this stuff sounds benign, but it's about closing hospitals. It's about losing access to your local GP. A lot of people are finding they're losing access to their local GP, but they don't know that it's policy because it's not discussed. And Stephen's personal meetings with some people who might otherwise have talked about it may have a part to play in that. So it would be interesting to ask Major, the people who could have talked about it and didn't over the last few years, have they been slimed personally by Stevens with his charming manners? Because we're basically hearing he's a very nice man. That's what you remember Heidi Alexander told campaigners when they were showing her the evidence. They came with tons of evidence. They're closing this, they're closing that, they're doing, but he's a nice man. I met him, he's a nice man. Oh, fine. Well, then forget the hospitals, forget the NHS. Yes, he's a nice man. That's more important, isn't it?
So, I think you need to invite him onto Socialist Telly and ask him these questions directly myself.
Yeah, we should.
I mean,
you reckon he'll come?
He's had a way of not
he's a nice guy.
Being accountable when he could have been held accountable. And, there was this one program he came on in 2014 where people sent in questions, and it was one after the other. They were asking him, since you campaigned for healthcare to be part of US trade deals, how can we trust you to be here? And he kept changing the subject, kept saying, even the interviewer saying, I'm sorry, but with all due respect, you haven't answered the question. And then he kept saying, and in contrast, he's interviewed by the, what's it called again? The IOD, Institute of Directors, big business thing. You can find it on YouTube. And the interviewer asks him, so you've come up with this 5-year forward view. It's very bold, and tell us what it's about. And he says, we want the NHS to be more permeable to the private sector, to the good things that are happening in the private sector. So one speech for one group, one speech for another group. But it's also interesting what he was saying when he was not answering the questions. He kept referring to integrated care. So he refers to the model in Torbay, which is where Kaiser Permanente was brought in under his government, in Tony Blair's government, to set up pilot projects. And he's saying, we're rolling this out today. And you've got somebody on Twitter from actually the Centre for the Health and the Public Interest, which is, a good centre-left think tank. But this guy is saying, no, there's no evidence that there's continuity between US style integrated care in the 2000s, or the influence of HMOs, which is a synonym for that, in the 1990 legislation, and the current rolling out of that. And the guy's saying himself, we're taking the model that we've developed basically with Kaiser Permanente, though he's not saying that on the radio, and we're rolling it out. That's the future we want to see. And it would have been the same if it wasn't Stevens. The guy who was there before him also said, Torbay, I've seen the future, it's Torbay, David Nicholson. So I think that there's a lot of that needs to be looked at again in terms of the history of what's happened over the last 30 years, because it's what we're faced with now. I don't know if we talk about it now. I mean, we have the legislation, obviously, that's sealing this in. I want to throw
That's
this in.
where we were just about to go with the whole legislation of all of this.
Can I throw it in? Can I go into that?
Go for it.
Is that we've known for years, anybody, close watchers have known that Labour's got this line that they put out for the public, that suggests they're kind of moving towards maybe one day, maybe supporting a public service called the NHS. But they're not quite there yet. They need to be convinced. It needs to be explained to them that it's a popular thing. If you visit our country, you might know that it's a popular thing, like they don't know, yeah? And so we have things like, the NHS will be the preferred provider, and we'll put a cap on profit. This was before Corbyn, but it was also in the 2017 manifesto, copied and pasted. It was such a tragedy to have it in there. And speaking of that tragedy, Sajid Javid, sorry, I get his name wrong. I got dyslexic with his name. But the current health minister, secretary, Sajid Javid, is quoted Labour's support for what is basically crony contracts. And John Ashworth said, yes, we asked for that 10 years ago. That is getting rid of competition regulation. They presented that as moving towards public service, but it wasn't. And it's the crony contracts of today, and it's the way that accountable care organizations or integrated care systems or HMOs, they have an exemption from competition law in the US, so they can make mergers, acquisitions, and so on, without having to go through a tendering process and being subject to scrutiny on competition. And it's Labour policy and it's Tory policy, except Sajid Javid said one thing. He said Labour members must support it because it was in the 2015, 2017, and 2019 manifestos. And Labour members don't support it because we specifically warned them. We specifically told them, and you, Bonnie, you brought the third motion of these, 2017, 18, and 19. I know you had one in 2016 that condemned sustainability transformation plans, but from 2017 we said that Labour will not go along with tweaking the Health and Social Care Act and instead commit to renationalisation based on the NHS bill. That's because that seeks to do that anyway. That's what we set out, and so now that Ashworth and Javid are quoting Corbyn's manifestos in support of crony contracts, we have to say it's not in our name. I know Corbyn's office didn't know that was happening, that Ashworth did that, but Labour conference said no, you're not doing it in our name. I'll throw that in. I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks, Nico. Yusuf, did you want to say any more as well about the legislation that we've been witnessing through this process?
Yeah, I mean, I think we just have to backtrack a minute, a step back, because I think to us some of this stuff seems self-evident, but it's not to the public, and it's not even to the health think tank bubble, all of this, certainly not health correspondents or the media presentation of this stuff. So I think just to summarize quickly what we've seen, I think before we really go into the kind of deep end of the culmination of 4 decades of dismantling the NHS with this catastrophic market and privatization experiment, is I think the first step was in the 80s and 90s was the introduction of a limited market. I think from 2000 we've seen the expansion of that market under New Labour through PFI, through more outsourcing. From 2010 was the third phase, which was the Lansley Health and Social Care reforms, and that again expanded the market, expanded privatization, private sector outsourcing, doubled it in terms of contract percentages. It most importantly paved the way for a two-tier system inside our hospitals, which now exists, which was allowing the amount of private patients in NHS hospitals to be up to half. And that's something that big centres, world famous names, have really taken advantage of, the likes of the Royal Marsden, as reported in the Times. World famous cancer centre back in 2017 was making 45% of its income from non-NHS sources, meaning international rich, national rich, charities, whatever it might be. So there was a two-tier system, or there is a two-tier system inside these, some of these particularly big NHS hospitals, such as the Marsden, the Royal Marsden, Great Ormond Street, Imperial, Guy's and St Thomas's, where you've got basically a two-track system. If you've got money, you're going to be fast-tracked. If not, you're going to be languishing on waiting lists, and that applies to even to, potentially to cancer care. We've seen that delayed significantly pre-COVID, but particularly because of COVID. But I won't go into too much detail on that. So that was the kind of Health and Social Care Act. I know I've missed a couple of aspects of it. I don't think we need to get bogged down in the kind of details of the legalese. And now we are on to the current phase, which is what we've been, obviously Nico has been addressing here, which is this US style integrated care. And I think one of the things that happened with the Conservative-led coalition with the Lansley reforms was to say, basically, there's an obligation on your CCGs, on your clinical commissioning groups here. I mean, some of this was quite ambiguous, but essentially there was an obligation to tender these contracts, competitive tendering, and to put them out to a bid for most contracts that were coming up for renewal. But actually, at the time, one of the consequences was that when Nico now touched on Simon Stevens and the restructuring program, is that, yes, exactly, the likes of Circa United Health pulled back from clinical frontline services because they were not particularly lucrative or profitable. That was reported in the health trades press, and they said they were going to concentrate more on kind of backroom stuff, maybe administrative services, whatever it might be. And so I think the push for this kind of US style integrated care, which means we've really got to, I think, nail kind of home what that actually means. What it means is that you are carving up the NHS into these 42 footprints, and you're basically creating multi-billion, up to 10-year, sometimes more, contracts for whole regions of health and social care. And that's what we're dealing with right now, which is basically to create massive opportunities for profit and revenue for corporations and financial institutions. And so that I think is being designed because that creates economies of scale. And one of the other things they're trying to do is to create networks of GP surgeries, chains of hospitals, because if you are, the reason the likes of Circa or whoever it might have been temporarily took a step back is that if you're going to run a single-handed small GP surgery, or you're going to run, I don't know, a physiotherapy musculoskeletal contract, that's probably not going to be particularly lucrative compared to running a whole chain or network of GP surgeries. And one of the things we're seeing now, I say this as a GP where I'm working in North Oxfordshire, but it's happening across the country, is that GP surgeries are kind of being incentivized through obviously the carrot of funding, or conversely being hit with the stick of not having that funding, of merging into these basically super surgeries, these networks of GP surgeries. And what you're seeing seems to be a clear deterioration of care. And Nico was talking about your access to your GP surgery. I know from what's happening locally, we're luckily enough still a traditional family doctor surgery, and if you're lucky, that's what you will have as a patient. But what you're seeing with these super surgeries is that it's very hard to access, even harder to access this restriction of care. And I know from a friend of mine who was whose family were a patient, they've got a baby, for them to try and access services there, they would phone up and they'd be 70 something in the queue, whatever it might be. And that deterioration has happened where you've taken a whole group of family run traditional GPs and you've merged them into this super surgery. And then the spiel we're seeing from the Department of Health is, oh, we're going to be able to provide better patient care at scale to 30 to 50,000 patients, rather than your traditional model of, say, single digit thousands, maybe 8, 10, 12,000, whatever it might be. So that's one of the things that's happening, and we're seeing chains of obviously, I guess one of the things they've talked about with the reforms. I'm sorry, I've forgotten the name of them now. It was one of the key people who's I think became a peer. Lord, his surname begins with a D. I've forgotten it now, but he was one of the people who introduced these reforms to create chains of super hospitals. So these are economies of scale that are intended to be much more lucrative and profitable compared to even the Lansley reforms. So that's one of the main consequences here.
Of course, the continuity of care from the same family GP is totally lost by these systems. In many of these massive practices, you're lucky if you can see a doctor. And obviously, as time's gone on, some people's health conditions have become increasingly complex, and some chronic conditions overlap each other. And of course, understanding of a person's family history as well. Whilst you might have some notes, it's not the same as having the knowledge and understanding of the patient that's sat in front of you to know what they're dealing with. So that's a massive problem. Obviously, we're not just talking about the removal of our hospitals, we're talking about the removal of our care from under GPs as well. Yep. So
which is absolutely critical. Sorry, I'll just chime in there, because a lot of this integrated care stuff is being sold as care in the community. So we saw the care in the community program with mental health, which became a disaster. And that was justified similarly in a kind of moral, ethical dimension, as saying, look, these kind of psychiatric institutions, they are inhumane, which may have been the case. And so what we're going to do, what Thatcher did, under the stewardship of her team and whoever else, was to close down a lot of these psychiatric institutions. I know this because my late father was a consultant psychiatrist, and he fought against this stuff in the 80s. And what we have with the present mental health crisis, and mental health became the testing ground for privatization. We now see, huge amounts of outsourcing to the Priory and other groups in mental health. And at the same time, what you see with that marketization, with that privatization, is that what dovetails with that is this massive program of cuts, of closures, of mergers. Because what you're doing is you're shrinking the NHS estate, and you're ramping up simultaneously the private provision of care through, especially facilities and buildings that are public-private partnerships that are PFIs. And that's continuing, by the way, as PPP, public-private partnership, instead of PFI. It's a rebranding thing. Osborne was the first to rebrand it as PFI2, and then Theresa May came along and did something else convoluted that I've kind of forgotten about now, but was basically a public-private partnership. So this happened with mental health. It's now being transplanted into physical health, if you like. So you're seeing a nationwide, the same pattern locally. Everywhere I've traveled with my book over the past few years, it's the same pattern. And that's, a very educational process for me, is that where I've gone to, Oxfordshire, to London, to the north, to wherever it might be, you see that pattern of your local, cottage or district general hospital losing its services, and of course the other PFI hospitals in the area are kept going because they are a funding stream for those kind of vested interests, and you're seeing the same with GP practices. Hundreds of GP practices across the country closing. Walk-in centres, something like, last time I checked, a third to a quarter of them had gone. So this is the kind of shrinkage of the NHS estate. I saw this very visibly where I was for the best part of a decade in East London, in Tower Hamlets. The London Chest Hospital, kind of again renowned heart and lung centre, was closed down and replaced with housing. Mile End, which was a decent small hospital, which had an A&E, had maternity services, all of that gradually stripped out. I did my care of the elderly training there. That's gone. Those kind of rehab wards have gone. Even the longer stay wards are going. So gradually, a whole hospital just basically being disemboweled
And the land sold off for great profits as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Very valuable land. If you look at central London, particularly huge swathes of land that belong to the Department of Health, used to be offices, buildings. That's all been, I saw that in the time I was living in Southwark, just razed to the ground and replaced with housing by Barratt, Britain's biggest home builder. So this is the pattern across the country. And then we say at the same time that, of course, you've mentioned complex needs. We talk about this aging population meme, which is obviously designed to distract you and confuse you, smoke and mirrors, from the real issues we've talked about, such as £300 billion of PFI and all the other costs of privatisation. But, we have an aging population. We have greater health needs. These things, to some extent, are real. And yet we are shrinking the NHS estate, NHS hospitals, NHS facilities. And then we say, it's not just a winter crisis, it's an all year round crisis. How is this possible? It's because of aging population, or it's your fault for being old, for having paid your whole life, your taxes and worked hard. It's your fault now that the NHS is in crisis, or it's because of immigrants and health tourism, or it's because, the NHS is it's this bloated, public bureaucracy that's inefficient.
Well, I mean, we're obviously also seeing the rationing of care as well, with all sorts of excuses being used why certain individuals shouldn't get the care that they need. So, for example, groups that have been targeted include smokers or ex-smokers, people that are overweight, and whatever. These are very much the ploys of an insurance company finding a way to get out of meeting their responsibilities and paying for the treatments that are required by somebody. If someone's sick, they need to be treated. So we've kind of skipped over quite a few of those steps there, but because we've got 10 minutes left to go, I think it's fair to say that we've seen the de-skilling of the workforce in the NHS. We've seen the attacks on the junior doctors. We've seen the removal of the nurses bursary and so on. And now we really are at the final stage now, sadly, which in your book, it's called Restructure the NHS into a US-style insurance system. So can you explain how that works in a couple of minutes? Go.
Yeah, that's basically what we've been talking about, which is that you take the Lansley reforms of this obligation for tendering, competitive tendering of contracts for bidding from these private companies. And you basically, what Simon Stevens was pushing after his tenure at United Health as a senior executive there is a US-style system where you basically, instead of competitive tendering, instead of competition, you basically award. What you have is these integrated care boards where you will be able to have representation from these private companies on there. You will award these contracts for whole chunks, whole swathes of regional health and social care up and down the country. So 42 regions in the English NHS, and that is basically far from what we're hearing, which is this incredible rhetoric from the mainstream media, from the health think tanks, which is, this is wonderful. This is going to integrate health and social care. It's going to make social care more like the NHS, and you're going to see wonderful coordination and all of this. That's not what's on the table. This is management speak. It is not integration that's on the table. What is on the table is creating these massive regional health and social care contracts, multi-billion 10-year contracts, for example, that are obviously even more profitable. So what you're doing is far from reversing the market doctrine of competition, and that doesn't make any sense if you just do a simple thought experiment and you take a step back and you say, why, after 4 decades of neoliberal extreme free market orthodoxy with no pressure, Corbyn is gone, the left is sadly in disarray, why on earth would an extreme right-wing libertarian such as Boris Johnson and his government, after what they've done with COVID, which has been a complete free-for-all in terms of privatization, why on earth would that same government then go, we're just going to reverse 40 years of free market doctrine, and we've decided we're going to go back towards some kind of renationalization of the NHS? Doesn't make any sense. What you're actually doing is, of course, consolidating privatization through this.
Privatization and fragmentation as well. So
Yep.
services are becoming less joined up than they were previously, and budgets and rationing and all of that is now very, very locally controlled rather than as part of a nationwide strategy, really. So, Nico, did you want to jump in quickly there?
Yeah, can I try and share my screen for a few seconds? I'm not sure if it's going to work. A quick go. I want to look at a tiny bit of footage. Share screen. I'm going to have to learn how to do it. Share screen. Am I on the right screen?
No, we're using a new system now.
No, I haven't got it. Chrome tab. Oh yes, maybe I do. Let me try it. What can you can just see me, can't you?
I
think no, it hasn't worked.
Okay.
When the 1990 legislation was announced, this model of integrated care was part of it. Andrew Lansley, you can find him talking about integration, and he's talking about this same system. I want to quickly say what it is. It's a bunch of entities that come together, public or private. They have a budget, and they will get financial rewards for anything that they cut from healthcare spending. That's what that is. And so that drives all the reduction in care that you're talking about. It's a thing it's the core of the new system that we're having.
It's just siphoning out the money, isn't it? It's
away
more
from
important that it's an argument about where money is spent than how much funding is received by this entity called the NHS.
Because it isn't the NHS. It's
because it isn't the NHS. It's a badge. Indeed. So we're into the last couple of minutes of the show. Hopefully we've helped a lot of people understand all that's been going on in our NHS. And obviously there's new legislation being progressed at the moment, which is going to bake in a hell of a lot of the problems that we've identified with the NHS. So we need to fight against that. And there are some actions that everybody watching this can take straight away. The first thing is the government are planning to give away everybody's health data to whoever wants it. And now we know in the context of this drive for an insurance-based system, this is going to land in the laps of the insurance companies, who will scour everybody's data to try and find a way of either denying contracts with people or increasing premiums to such a point that they become totally unaffordable for even moderately well-off people. Insurance companies are in the business of not making payments, not being charitable and paying for things. So this data, which will be collected, will be stored under someone else's name, but the data is so detailed that it will be perfectly possible for these insurance companies, accountancy companies and everything else who've got enormous resources to find out precisely who the data is actually talking about, or with good enough reason to believe that that's you. So, for example, if you've got a history of having had mental health issues, or if there are a lot of cases of, let's say, certain types of cancer in your family, then you're going to present a higher risk to these insurance companies. And even without that, do we really want to hand over all of our data to unknown private corporations? I would say probably not. So there are two things that I would ask everybody watching this to do. First of all, write to your GP on behalf of all of your family members and tell them that you want to opt out of the data share. And then also you need to go.
You have to print out a form.
Yes.
And you have to sign that and hand it in, which I've forgotten the exact name of the form. But yeah, there we are. If you find that, I'm sure if you Google that opt-out form, yeah.
So yeah, you need to do both of those steps to make sure your data is kept secure. I would strongly recommend you get a copy of Yusuf's book, How to Dismantle the NHS in 10 Easy Steps, and let us know if you've got any questions on it through our social media streams. We'll try and get back to you. A couple of things to watch. Michael Moore's Sicko is a fantastic documentary about what's happening. It lays out what's happened in the US and what's coming here. Bob Gill's got a couple of films, The Great NHS Heist and Sell Off, both available on YouTube. Give them a watch. And then you've got to really challenge your local Labour Party to stand up for the NHS. Make them see how angry you are with what's going on. Write to your MP, whether they're Labour or anything else. Tell them that you will not vote for somebody who can turn a blind eye to what's being stolen from us. It's our birthright. We need to protect it. Any final comments from either of you two there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's absolutely finishing on a positive note, because we've critiqued this, but it's what you can do. Otherwise, people just feel helpless and powerless, and that's absolutely it. Just go and tell, the rest of your family members. Go and tell a couple of friends. You need to put pressure through grassroots campaigning and movements. It's only through mass movements. If you look at the history of women's rights, of civil rights, of LGBT rights, whatever it might be, it's only through mass movements that put pressure on powerful elites that anything changes for the better, really. And